Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
This weekend, Liberals will be gathering in our nation's capital to pick their new leader, and in turn, Canada's next Prime Minister. Many Liberals have already cast their ballots. However, voting will continue until just a few hours before the winner is announced on Sunday. There are just 4 candidates left in the campaign: former Bank of Canada Governor Mark Carney, former Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland, former House Leader Karina Gould, and former MP Frank Baylis. When the winner takes the reins, it will be the end of the Justin Trudeau era after 9 years of him leading the country.
This has been the honor of my life serving Canadians.
I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney, and today on The Big Story, I'm joined by Greg MacEachern, a former Liberal ministerial staffer and strategist, now principal at Can Strategies. We'll speak about what will happen with this vote, how the transition of power will play out, and when Canadians can expect a general election. Greg, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure, Cormac.
We're almost at the end of the Liberal leadership race. How would you describe this campaign?
Truncated, on fast forward, and very focused on what really matters at a time when Canada is under a lot of international pressure. This is not like a campaign that I've ever seen. We've had examples in the past, notably Ontario with Doug Ford, where, if need be, you can do a leadership very quickly. And I think the Liberals obviously were put in that situation. So you didn't have a lot of extra, what you might term fluff on this. It's been very focused about, the threats from the United States and who is best equipped to handle threat.
I would assume you would say that Donald Trump had a very big impact on this campaign.
Donald Trump absolutely did have an impact. When you look back on the kind of the last straw, so to speak, for caucus was how the Prime Minister and his office handled the what was expected to be a just prior to Christmas cabinet shuffle. And that cabinet shuffle was really focused on how the Canadian government and how the Trudeau administration was going to deal with Donald Trump. There were going to be some people moved out, notably Chrystia Freeland, 2 other roles. We know what happened. It did not go over very well. I think the way it was handled gave the Liberal caucus a lot of pause and concern. And it followed up on many caucus meetings where these concerns were being brought forward. So that in itself, that threat of Donald Trump causing the Prime Minister to consider changing up his cabinet really set off a road domino that we're going to see part of the result of that this weekend. But there's still, buckle your seatbelts. There's still a lot more to come.
Yeah, and do you think the coverage of this trade war impacted the race in any way? Because normally Canadians and even Liberals would be watching such a heated race. This is the race to potentially choose the next Prime Minister, and yet you didn't see as much news about it as you normally would under normal times.
What I noticed was a huge change in what the issues of the day were. And we also saw, if you're looking for empirical data, if you're looking for, key points, we saw a huge switch in polling in Canada. So 2024, if there had been an election, it was going to be about Justin Trudeau and it was going to be about carbon pricing, carbon taxes. And instead, that has totally gone by the wayside. You see a lot of the focus that was going to be on things like housing at some points suddenly vanish. And now it's all about the existential threat of the United States.
So we have 4 candidates in the race: former Bank of Canada Governor Mark Carney, former Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland, former House Leader Karina Gould, and former MP Frank Baylis. What are you expecting to see on Sunday when those results are read out?
Well, anything can happen because it's been a short leadership race. But again, if you're looking at data, it seems to be that Mark Carney is the front runner. And we can look at things like fundraising. So in terms of what's been submitted, we know that Mark Carney's team has been leading that. I think, the last official count was 1.9 million. I'm told that his fundraising is now well over 4 million. I think Kriya Gould surprised a lot of people. She was very front and center during the leadership debates. She done well on fundraising. There was the second to last contribution that camps had to make. She had to make an appeal to hit that. And then I noticed for the final installment of the, what you need to contribute to stay in the leadership race, she didn't have to make an appeal, and her camp paid it off early. So I think there's been a bit of a surprise in terms of how well Kriya Gould has done. And a lot of people are watching to see who's going to come second. And will, Kriya Gould overtake Chrystia Freeland?
This is a ranked ballot, and for our listeners, if they haven't heard our previous podcast on this or don't really know how the ranked ballot system works, essentially people make their first choice and then a second choice, and they rank the candidates from first to last. And if nobody has more than 50% of the vote on the first counting of the ballots, then the last place person gets knocked off, and the ballots that went to them, they look at the second choice and then distribute those ballots appropriately until somebody eventually has 50% of the vote. Do you think this is going to be a first ballot win, or is this probably going a couple of rounds, and then could the ranked ballot system change things in terms of who's expected to win?
You definitely see from the Carney campaign the effort to win on the first ballot. I've had friends in media that have complained about Mark Carney's lack of availability to them for sit-down interviews. I did notice as those kind of complaints came up, his media availability became more frequent. But if you talk to the Carney campaign, what they were saying is we need to be in the riding. We need to, because of the point system, it's not just a vote. There's a weighted aspect in terms of the riding. They needed to concentrate on that as well. And so their efforts would be obviously to have a very decisive first ballot win. The challenge with such a short rate and how quickly things have happened. There's only there were 2 nights of debates. It's really hard to determine where that will land, if indeed it will be a first ballot victory. In some ways, for the party and its ability to move forward and say to Canadians, look, we have selected our new leader. They're now the prime minister. We are ready to hit the ground running. There was a bunch of people that could have ran for leader and didn't, stayed in their cabinet jobs to fight for Canada, and we're now ready to go. If the narrative is a first ballot victory for Mr. Carney, that aids into that getting down to business narrative.
More on the big story in a moment with Greg MacEachern, a principal at Can Strategies and a former Liberal ministerial staffer and strategist, speaking about the Liberal leadership vote. So let's talk a little bit about what happens after a new leader has been picked. How will this transition work? What are we looking at in terms of a swearing in and then becoming the new prime minister? Because again, for our listeners, just because they win the leadership doesn't make them the prime minister until they're actually sworn in at Rideau Hall in front of the Governor General. So what are we expecting in terms of timelines here?
In 2003, I had the vantage point, very unique one, of being one of the staffers that was on the advance team for Paul Martin when he was announced as leader. Now, formally, you're not sworn in, but I could tell you watching the security detail around him suddenly increase, there are some things that will be immediate that may not be obvious to the average Canadian. But yes, there has to be a swearing in. There would have to be a cabinet chosen. And then there'd have to be decisions around whether or not we're going to see the return of Parliament. And so this is heavy water cooler. And I would say watering hole conversation in Ottawa right now is, what will the victor do? Will Parliament return? Will there be a large cabinet changes, or will it be tweaked? And again, I think being mindful of the Canadian sentiment right now that we have this huge challenge in front of us. I think all of those decisions would be definitely put through the lens of are we addressing what Canadians want us to address right now?
In terms of the swearing in, would you expect it to happen within days after a new leader is chosen?
I'm not advising Mr. Kearney, but if I was, I would remind his team to be mindful of that same Canadian sentiment of what they're concerned about. And this is not a time to dither. You want this job, so you have to show that you are immediately ready for it and you can hit the ground running. So I think any delays, given that there is a transition process, there are things that have to happen in terms of the swearing in, things like that. But I think if you're trying to say to Canadians, I'm ready for this job on day one, you have to have your timelines pretty well set and being very specific.
Now, in terms of a cabinet, because the cabinet goes with the prime minister, so a new cabinet would have to be sworn in, and you've signaled that maybe there shouldn't be a lot of change because of what we're facing as a country. Would you expect him to put in place a large cabinet, just rubber stamp the cabinet that's already there? Would he make some changes? Would he have a smaller cabinet potentially if we're heading to a general election soon?
It's interesting, whatever the new Liberal leader will be doing, it'll be following a provincial election in Ontario, where Doug Ford, as Premier of Ontario, during the election was going to Washington, participating in Team Canada efforts, but yet as PC leader for Ontario, also running an election. So that, I think, is a recent example that people should be mindful of. And the new leader will be the Prime Minister, obviously. There will be cabinet ministers that I would suspect are pretty integral to what is happening right now in terms of defending Canadian interest. And it would be probably for the best to lead them in those roles. And Dominic LeBlanc, Finance Minister, Intergovernmental Affairs Minister, immediately comes to mind. There would be some tweaking as well, because I believe there are some people in cabinet that may not be running in the next election, and that may decide whether or not that, what they want to do in terms of tweaks. That is the word. I keep using tweaks because, when you hear intel around Ottawa, that not, we're told not to expect a major cabinet shuffle. And again, I think a major cabinet shuffle has the potential to look very ceremonial at a time when people don't want ceremony. They want action. They want, their government to get down to business and protect.
Yeah. And if we are heading to a general election, there will be time for a larger cabinet shuffle later. But in the interim, you might want to leave people in place, as you point out, Finance Minister Dominic LeBlanc, who is constantly texting with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. Those kinds of relationships really matter when the country is facing this economic threat. Now, in terms of a general election, what have you been hearing about the potential of a snap election before the House of Commons is set to return March 24th?
So when, we're kind of geeks in this town, and when we, game this out in terms of, what could happen, I mean, if the House returns, there has to be a speech from the throne. That would be read by the Governor General. And it also might emphasize the fact, even though that the speech would be read in the Senate, that if it's Mark Carney, he would not, he doesn't have a seat in the House. So he would be operating from the foyer, the gallery. I'm not sure a lot of Canadians in a short period of time would notice a big difference. But that speech from the throne would be, might be an opportunity to lay out your plans, but in terms of, it is a communications tool. It's being read by someone else. And you're facing opposition leaders who have declared that the first opportunity, they're going to defeat you. So as a new Liberal leader and the Prime Minister, your decision is probably going to be, I would like to choose my fate versus the opposition leaders do that. So my money would be on the House not returning and that election being called very, very soon. And again, the leader of the opposition has been calling for an election for some time.
And I will point out for our listeners that Chrystia Freeland has been on the record saying that she would attempt to bring the House back rather than pulled the trigger herself on a potential federal election, saying she would attempt to govern because now would not be the time to do that. Carney has not ruled out a snap election, saying he'll wait until the leadership race is done, and if he's the leader, he'll decide what is best for the country at that time. So depending on who gets picked will probably determine what happens next. Just before we go, I'm wondering if you can just weigh in on Justin Trudeau. As much as we're focused on who the next leader is going to be, these are the last moments for Justin Trudeau as Prime Minister after more than 9 years in that job. What do you think his legacy will be, and how will he be remembered by Canadians?
There is a term or in human resources, when you're working for a company and you give your notice, and they'll say, some of the advice that they will give you is, whatever your notice period is, 2-3 weeks, this is your most important time because of how people at this, organization are going to remember you, and who knows what's going to happen in the future. And I think since the time where the Prime Minister announced his resignation, and I think people are very much aware of not the course of action he wanted to take, his work and his efforts on behalf of Canada have been pretty impressive. I'm thinking of the Saturday night where he had addressed the country about tariffs. I think his response this week to the president. I see people that don't follow politics or were not necessarily fans of it being very, very complimentary. And I think, once we step back and there's, that cooling off period, you look at some prime ministers that might have been, in their day or when they left, not tremendously popular. But as time goes on, you're able to have the context of the time and what they did. I think Justin Trudeau will be looked upon very favorably for things like childcare, for the dental care. At a time when inflation was extremely high, there's only so many levers the government can push. And it's really tough sometimes to get help across. But there are things there that I think, the dental care one, it shows that they made a minority parliament work. And absolutely, this will help the health of Canadians long term. I do think, reasonably, though, there were decisions that he made where he could have headed off some of the challenges that, arrived on his doorstep. And to go from, a majority government to a minority after one term was not the norm. Usually in Canada, as unpopular as Mulroney was in, 87, 88, the election changed, the issue changed, and it was an issue of free trade. Kind of sounds familiar. And Mulroney won back-to-back majority. And that is something that the Prime Minister was not able to do. But we've also had many more minority parliament since 2000 than we did in the previous 50 years. So he may have been the Prime Minister that reflected a time where Canadians were happier having minority parliament, having much more diversity in terms of the political parties from the left to the right representing them in parliament. We won't know that for probably, another generation to come.
All right, Greg, we'll have to end it there. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and your thoughts. That was Greg MacEachern, a former Liberal ministerial staffer and strategist, now a principal at Can Strategy, speaking with me about the Liberal leadership vote, the transition of power, and when Canadians can expect a general election. I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney, and that was The Big Story. You can send us your feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. Thanks for listening.